quite a lot of games can be hard to follow. It can simply be hard to see what's going on at times, especially if you aren't the one playing. And my first thought about what's causing that was build systems. Perhaps this visual clutter was coming from games giving the player many different playstyle options. I mean, of course, it won't always be that, but lots of options for players means lots of effects, lots of different effects going off at lots of different times. If you can create your own pattern of play, your specific build that you've created does not have its damage rotation or whatever carefully curated by a game designer to be easy to visually understand. That's not the way of playing the game is built around. The game is built around many different ways to play, so of course none of them are specifically curated. Well, I suppose it's not entirely true. You arguably curated your build's, appearance or whatever. You arguably are your build's game designer. But meaning no offense, I bet that quite a few of you, when you make a build, do not think about how easy it'll be to watch. Welcome aboard, by the way. I'm Zandy, and I personally do think about readability sometimes when I make builds in games. Some of you do too, I'd imagine. It can be easier on the eyes, or it's just easier to visually digest. Sure, I also play a lot of this type of game. I've gotten used to it making videos like this. And that's another reason I thought maybe this was about build systems. If I'm noticing that a lot, well, I make videos about this topic a lot. Of course, I'm looking for games with build systems, and so if I'm seeing a lot of visual clutter, maybe it's because I'm looking for games with build systems. But to go a step further, well, I do play games with build systems in them a lot. And I've noticed that there is arguably a lot of visual clutter in those games with build systems. But I don't mind. Maybe a different way to look at it is, okay, so why don't I think that's bad? And here's my hypothesis. When I play these games, I know what my build is, so I know what effects to look for. You could argue that games with build systems are inherently easier to understand in some ways, because you're going in knowing what your build does. It's almost like you were the game designer for your build. You were the game designer for your build. And so the weird thing is just that only you, the build creator, the game designer sort of, find the game footage easy to follow, while your footage will be a bit hard to understand for others. Oh, that's exactly my situation. So, yeah, I mean, there are going to be some flashing lights on the screen in a moment. It's from normal gameplay footage, but just warning you. But you can basically tell what's going on here, right? This build drops the damaging areas and they stack up with the slows and the enemies. I want to see how these ideas match up to some example games. How do games' build systems influence their visual clarity, or what's the relationship between what you see on the screen and what the game is offering you for build options? Maybe that has to do with a lot of the visual clutter we see. How do games' build systems influence their visual clarity? They definitely do influence it, just what can we learn? Hades 2. Okay, sure, there are lots of different effects potentially executed in a quick, dense sequence, but you get those effects online one at a time, literally one boon after another. And so that makes it maybe a little easier to digest for you, the person who made the build. You saw each of the effects, the many effects in the build, coming online one at a time. You might be able to more easily remember picking each of those effects. This game also has this interesting system where you can only have one core boon for your attack and special and such. One boon, one effect, which is the basic thing your attack or your special will do when you hit enemies. So that also makes it a bit easier to follow. Yes, effects may branch off of that one core boon, and you get other effects that don't just affect your attack or your special. But at least you have a narrow starting point to keep in mind. I did my attack and then maybe a chain reaction went off. And as a result, I think this game feels pretty clear most of the time. My actions feel pretty clear, but where things get a little more questionable is with enemy attacks. This is a lot of enemies to keep an eye on, enemies which can do big run-ending damage at times, sometimes from range. Often I'm going in with absurd burst damage, as you'll see in some of these clips, and that came about because there's such an outsized benefit to bursting these enemies down. You don't have to keep track of them if they just die really quick. That's not necessarily bad, wanting to burst down enemies really quick, but it does make some styles of play very challenging. If you plan to manually dodge many attacks and not simply overpower them with your build's raw output and durability, Yeah, that's a lot to keep an eye on, right? Imagine manually dodging most of that instead of just whatever I did, shooting rockets at them. So I think it's more the enemies that are the concern here for visual clarity. I'd go as far as to say that an attack creating a lot of visual clutter, like a big explosion, would make it a little weaker in practice for certain playstyles in Hades 2, almost like a strange form of balancing for some attacks. We do have some games where the game's central concept makes it a bit noisy. Against Great Darkness here has you juggling these discs that you're seeing bounce around the screen. And usually a successful juggle will trigger one of your items effects, and of course hitting enemies with the discs does damage. There are some more straightforward weapons that you can use as well as the discs, but inherently this design does make what you're doing the complex thing visually. And here maybe it's less weird for visual complexity to balance things out. That's kind of the point. How many discs are you going to be able to juggle on your own? It's more and more damage, but more to keep track of, and then you lose some, and that's the point. That's okay. It's part of the game's push and pull. Enemies, on the other hand, spawn in well-defined squadrons in this game, and well, it's very linear. So here the enemies can be pretty manageable to keep track of, and it's more your actions that are a bit of a lot to keep track of. I suppose if you lose track of a disc, that's fine in a way, you don't get hurt. I think this is still hard to mentally keep track of, but shifting the overwhelming thing to your actions is certainly an approach. That lowers the stakes. If you get overwhelmed, you just juggle less. All right, balance and visual clarity have a somewhat deeper relationship than just lots of effects making it hard to see. They are a pretty coherent part of a lot of these games' designs. But I also think there's a lot in the idea of build systems allowing you to make builds that overcome challenges you can't even see, can't see yet, or just can't visually process. One of the interesting mechanics in Against Great Darkness here, for example, is that some abilities allow you to create a sort of bumper at the bottom of the screen. You see that white light, and this will auto-deflect discs for a short time. And obviously some of the examples from earlier fit too. I still don't really know exactly where enemies are or what's going on here, and it doesn't exactly matter. In Warframe, you can use area of effect abilities, modified for more range, maybe more strength, more damage, to defeat enemies beyond your line of sight, potentially in rooms you have not reached yet. And of course, you can use zone control, or abilities that remain in an area after use, modified for more duration, to weaken or destroy enemies which have not arrived yet. This is a game with huge hordes of often endlessly spawning enemies, so killing an extra room of enemies beyond the one you're in is frequently useful. At the very least, they can just make missions like this with a long linear series of enemies go much faster, as fast as I can run. Again, obviously in this situation, I really don't need to be able to see what's happening on the screen very clearly because it's already over by the time I get there. You might think, why is it fun to set up the game in such a way that by the time you arrive at the content, it's over, you've already defeated it? But I would contend that you did have fun with that content, you just defeated it or you challenged it before you got into gameplay. When you were making your build, you were fighting, defeating that content. And then when you arrive, you get to see the results of you attacking those enemies. Again, it goes back to that first section where you know what you made on your build, and so you kind of understand what you're seeing in a way that is different from it being visually clear. It's not, but you still know what's going on. And in Nova Drift, well, there's a whole lot of ways that you can kind of automate the process of killing enemies or do things to worry a little bit less about exactly where they are. The first thing is this screen wrapping ability. In this game, you can fly off one edge of the screen and come out the other. And this is an ability that most enemies don't have, so it's a way for you to kind of get out of there if things get overwhelming. Being able to fly off the side of the screen lets you kind of reposition and reorient yourself, and most enemies can't do that, sure. There's also, of course, what you're seeing here, making your build kind of finish the fight on the build screen, making yourself tanky enough or strong when you fly forward enough that you don't have to focus that much on what's going on in front of you, and you can just hit the pedal to the metal and fly through enemies over and over. It is also true that playing that type of playstyle removes a mental burden. You don't have to think about what you're going to do with your gameplay as much, which gives you a moment to mentally step back, look at the battlefield and see, do I need to fly into this enemy a little bit more or whatever? Am I taking more damage, and maybe what enemy is causing that? It's easier to think about that when you don't have to pay attention to which direction you're driving in. Naturally, you can go even further. This build has a modifier on that makes me and everything else on the stage take constant damage, so you'll see that enemies will die without me interacting with them directly in any way, provided I can keep my tankiness high enough, keep myself out of danger enough, that I don't die to that damage as well. If this all seems a little bit too automation focused, you can always do this in another way, make an attack that you need to charge up at great length and then unleash it in one glorious blow. Use that as a way to kind of mentally reorient. You need to be doing nothing for your build to do its damage. You use that time to kind of mentally reorient yourself, and then when you're ready, you fire off that damage you've stored up. Getting more into that classic relationship between build systems and automation, these builds sidestep the issue of needing to see your enemies through crazy effects precisely by creating weapons which don't require you to see your targets precisely. And I think they feel as strong as they are partly because they eliminate the challenge of processing enemy attacks right in front of you, because they find their targets faster than you could notice and comprehend them yourself. Yet importantly, they're still devices you created yourself. You kind of made up for your human limitations with your build decisions. The game isn't exactly just playing itself. You made it play itself in some way. That reminds me of one of my favorite ways to think about power fantasy as a concept, that it's more about pushing the game back in a sort of ongoing power clash rather than totally overcoming it and deleting difficulty entirely. You can see those moments of tension, that kind of clash between the enemy's stats and your build in Vampire Survivors. The idea that I'm kind of racing the leveling process with my own item build, trying to gain more power through synergy than the game will give enemies through more straightforward numbers, and then I see that in the gameplay. I think that's really cool. It makes my ideas feel powerful in a coherent way that I can really see. Well, I mean, not that you can really... Anyway, you get it. Well, I hope you get it anyway. You know, you don't get that feeling of power from being overwhelmingly superior to enemies. You get it from being able to fight them on a more abstract or meta plane, like fighting and holding your own in a new dimension, while maintaining that tension and sense of danger that your build will fail without interesting ideas. A little idealistic, I know, but I think that's a neat idea. And of course, at its best, you do still operate the gameplay. It's still fun to aim and shoot at enemies. You also get that fulfillment of your build kind of holding back the game's power scaling as well. I think having both at once is a really unique and cool experience that these types of games can provide. As for what we're seeing though, it's weird, right? Upon analysis, I'd say in many cases the visuals themselves are not directly what's meaningful. I'd argue there's almost no direct information here besides did I hit or miss, and is the enemy dead or not, their attacks. It's more of a representation of how my build's damage check is going in a different, more abstract arena, where the enemies are just kind of like a collective health bar or progress meter for how my build's damage output is going compared to the enemies. And so when a game's visuals are confusing, I think it's interesting to consider that they may not be primarily trying to be clear and readable. If the game's build systems are clear and readable, the moment-to-moment visuals may more represent how that build-making activity is going. This is close to making a build system into a primary gameplay loop, rather than a supporting secondary part of these games, which we'll have to talk about more sometime. I've been searching for approaches to make a game's primary gameplay loop a build system for a long time. I think this is one useful way to think about that. One of my goals for this channel is to understand, find, or achieve build systems as a primary gameplay loop, to get or to make games that are about making builds, not just games where that is a thing that exists. And we made some progress toward that goal this time, so I'm rather pleased. Folks, I've been Zandy. Glad to have you aboard. I try not to ask too much of you in these videos. I hope you got to relax a bit and enjoy this one. But you are our navigator, so you're up. Where are we off to next?